There are photographs that capture a moment in time so perfectly they become windows into history. And then there are photographs that capture something else entirely, something that was never meant to be seen. This is one of those photographs. The year is 1899, late autumn most likely. The image shows a classroom full of children, seated in rigid rows, their faces solemn and unsmiling. This was the age before casual photography, when sitting for a portrait required stillness, patience, and an almost painful formality. The children wear dark wool clothing, high collars buttoned to the chin, hair slicked or braided into place. Behind them, tall windows allow pale daylight to filter through, illuminating wooden desks, a chalkboard, and the faint outline of a world that no longer exists. At first glance, nothing appears wrong. These are simply children of another era, frozen in the sepia tones of early photography. Their expressions are typical for the time, serious, obedient, perhaps a little tired. The kind of image you might find in a dusty archive or framed in a historical society, labeled with a date and a place and nothing more. The photograph measures approximately 8 inches by 10 inches, printed on thick cardstock that has yellowed with age. The emulsion has cracked in places, creating fine spiderweb patterns across the surface. The corners are bent, suggesting the image was once handled frequently, passed from person to person, studied and discussed before being filed away and forgotten. On the reverse side, written in faded pencil, are the words, "School Picture 1899. No location, no names." Just a date and a description so generic it could apply to thousands of similar photographs from the same era. But this photograph is not like the others. Look closer, not at the children themselves, not at their carefully arranged postures or the stern geometry of the classroom. Look instead at the floor, at the space between the rows, at the light falling across the wooden planks in neat, predictable angles, except in one place. There, just to the left of the third row, a shadow stretches across the ground. It is long, dark, and distinctly human in shape. The shadow does not belong to any of the children. It does not match the teacher, who stands visible at the edge of the frame, her face partially obscured but her posture unmistakable. It does not correspond to the photographer, whose position would cast a shadow in the opposite direction, toward the front of the room rather than across the children. It simply exists, unexplained and impossible, as if someone stood among those children, someone the camera saw, but history chose to forget. Most viewers scroll past it. They see an old-school photo and move on, cataloguing it mentally as just another piece of historical ephemera. But those who pause, those who let their eyes adjust to the faded details, cannot unsee it. The shadow is too clear, too defined. It has weight and presence, and once noticed, it reframes the entire image. Suddenly, the children's stiff postures feel less like formality and more like fear. Their downcast eyes seem to avoid something. Their small hands grip the edges of desks, as if bracing against an unseen weight. The girl in the front row has her shoulders hunched forward, as if trying to make herself smaller. The boy in the second row has his jaw clenched so tightly that even through the blur of aged photography, the tension is visible. A child near the back appears to be holding her breath, her chest frozen mid-inhale. These are not the relaxed postures of children, simply bored by a long exposure. These are the postures of children who know something is wrong and are powerless to do anything about it. The photograph was donated to a regional historical archive in the early 1970s, part of a collection from a rural county in the Midwest. The donation came from an estate sale, the belongings of a woman who had died without heirs. Among her possessions were dozens of photographs, letters, and documents related to local history. Most were unremarkable, but this one, this single image, carried with it a weight that no one could quite explain. Archivists filed it away with a reference number and a brief description. For decades, it sat in a box, unexamined and unremarkable, until someone finally asked the question no one had thought to ask before. If no one cast this shadow, who did? The photograph would have remained forgotten if not for a local historian combing through county archives in search of material for a book on rural education. Her name was Dr. Elena Voss, a retired school teacher with a lifelong passion for preserving the stories of forgotten communities. She had spent years researching one-room schoolhouses, those small bastions of learning that had once dotted the American landscape, serving children in isolated farming regions where access to education was rare and precious. She found the image tucked between property deeds and census records, its edges yellowed but otherwise intact. She scanned it, uploaded it to a database, and moved on, cataloguing it as just another example of late 19th century educational history. But a colleague, reviewing the digital file weeks later, noticed the anomaly, the shadow, the impossible presence. He sent the file back to Dr. Voss with a single question: "What is this?" What began as curiosity quickly became obsession. Dr. Voss returned to the archive, this time with questions. Where had the photograph come from? Who were these children? And more importantly, what school was this? The archivist, a young woman named Claire who had worked there for less than a year, pulled the original donor records. The photograph had come from the estate of a woman named Martha Calloway, who had lived her entire life in the county and had been something of a reclusive collector of local history. Martha's belongings had been auctioned off after her death, and a local historical society had purchased several boxes of documents and photographs, donating them to the archive for preservation. The answers were harder to find than expected. County records from the late 1800s were incomplete at best, destroyed at worst. Fires, floods, and simple neglect had claimed entire decades of documentation. Many small rural schools operated without formal oversight, their existence recorded only in scattered letters, tax rolls, and personal diaries. But through painstaking cross-referencing, comparing names in census records with land deeds, matching birth dates with school enrollment ages, tracing family trees through genealogical databases, a location began to emerge. A one-room schoolhouse that had operated between 1887 and 1902, serving a cluster of farming families in a region now largely abandoned. The area had once been known as Timber Road, named for the dense stands of oak and hickory that had been logged nearly to extinction by the turn of the century. By the 1920s, most of the families had moved on, chasing better farmland or factory work in distant cities. The road itself had been reclaimed by nature, its path now visible only as a faint depression through overgrown fields. The school had no official name. Locals referred to it simply as the schoolhouse on Timber Road, though the road itself no longer appeared on modern maps. Enrollment records were sparse, handwritten in ledgers that had survived more by accident than design. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. Names appeared and disappeared without explanation. Attendance marks were inconsistent. Entire months were left blank, as if the school had simply ceased to exist for stretches of time, then resumed without comment. And then there were the inconsistencies. One ledger listed 23 students for the 1899 school year. But when compared to census data from the same period, only 22 children could be accounted for. One name appeared in the school record, but nowhere else. Not in birth registries, not in family Bibles, not in church records, not even in the county death index. It was as if the child had existed only within the walls of that schoolhouse, and nowhere beyond. The school itself closed abruptly in 1902. No official reason was given. No final report was filed with the County Board of Education. The building was sold to a neighboring farmer for a nominal sum, who used it for hay storage until it eventually collapsed in the 1940s. By then, the families who had once sent their children there were gone, scattered or dead, and the memories of what had happened dissolved into silence. But the photograph remained, and with it, the shadow, a presence that refused to be erased, even as history tried to forget. Dr. Voss printed the image and pinned it to the wall of her study, where it hung for weeks as she continued her research. At night, when the house was quiet, she found herself staring at it, counting the children, tracing the lines of their faces, following the angle of that impossible shadow. The more she looked, the more certain she became that this was not simply an error or an artifact of old photography. This was something else, something deliberate, something that had been waiting over a century to be seen. To understand what the photograph was hiding, experts in historical imagery were brought in to analyze every detail. These were specialists in early photographic techniques, individuals who could read light and shadow the way others read text. They examined exposure times, plate chemistry, and the physics of late 19th century cameras. What they found only deepened the mystery. Photography in 1899 was not instantaneous. Capturing an image required long exposure times, sometimes several seconds, during which the subjects had to remain perfectly still. Any movement would result in blur, a ghostly doubling of features. The children in this photograph show no such blur. They are sharp, frozen in place, which means they held their positions with extraordinary discipline or were forced to. Dr. Richard Hollis, a professor of photographic history at a Midwestern university, was the first to examine the image under magnification. He brought with him specialized equipment, digital microscopes, light meters, software capable of analyzing shadow angles and light sources with mathematical precision. He spent 3 days with the photograph, taking measurements, creating diagrams, reconstructing the exact conditions under which the image had been captured. The lighting in the room was natural, coming from 2 tall windows on the right side of the frame, based on the angle of the sunlight and the season indicated by clothing. Heavy wool, long sleeves, dark colors. The photograph was likely taken in late October or early November, sometime in the mid-morning when the sun would be at approximately 45 degrees above the horizon. The shadows cast by the children fall predictably to the left, consistent with the light source. The teacher's shadow, visible near the chalkboard, follows the same logic. Every element of the lighting behaves exactly as expected. Except one. The shadow in question originates from a point near the 3rd row of desks where no person stands. Its angle suggests a figure at least 6 feet tall, positioned slightly behind the children, perhaps 3 to 4 feet back from the nearest desk. The shape is unmistakable, a head, shoulders, and the faint suggestion of an arm extending forward. It is not a trick of light. It is not a double exposure. Dr. Hollis tested for both possibilities and ruled them out definitively. The shadow is the result of a solid object blocking the light source. A person, standing among the children when the photograph was taken. The children's faces, when examined closely under magnification, tell their own story. Several have eyes that do not look directly at the camera, but slightly past it, as if tracking something just out of frame. A girl in the 2nd row has her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles appear white even in the faded sepia tones. The fabric of her dress is wrinkled where she grips it, suggesting prolonged tension. A boy near the back has his jaw set in a way that suggests held breath, controlled fear. His eyes are wide, the pupils dilated even in the bright light of the room. These are not the relaxed postures of children, simply bored by a long exposure. These are the postures of children who know something is wrong, who are holding themselves together through sheer force of will. Children who have learned, through experience, that stillness is survival. One detail stands out above all others. In the bottom right corner of the photograph, barely visible beneath the edge of a desk, a small hand reaches out from behind the furniture. It does not belong to any of the seated children. It is too low, too far back. The hand appears to be gripping the edge of the wood, fingers white with pressure, as if someone crouched there, hidden from the camera's view, trying to stay out of sight, or trying to escape. Dr. Hollis presented his findings in a detailed report, complete with annotated diagrams and statistical analysis. His conclusion was unambiguous. The shadow was cast by a person standing in the room at the time of the photograph. A person who was not seated with the children, who was not visible in the frame, but whose presence was undeniable. The photograph was not just a record of a moment, it was evidence. And the shadow, impossible as it seemed, was not the only thing wrong with this image. The truth of what happened at that schoolhouse did not die with the generation that witnessed it. It lived on in whispers, in fragments of memory passed down through families who had once lived in that rural community. Descendants of those children, now scattered across the country, began to come forward after the photograph gained attention online. Dr. Voss created a website dedicated to the research, posting the image along with a request for information. Within weeks, emails began arriving. What they shared painted a picture far darker than any official record ever could. One woman, the great-granddaughter of a girl who had attended the school, recalled stories her grandmother told late in life, when memory and mortality had loosened the bonds of silence. The girl had spoken of a teacher who ruled with absolute authority, a man whose presence could silence a room with a single glance. He was not physically violent, she said, not in the way that left visible marks, but his punishments were psychological, designed to break the spirit rather than the body. Standing in corners for hours without movement, being locked in the coal cellar beneath the schoolhouse in darkness and cold until the lesson was learned, being made to write confessions for imagined sins, hundreds of lines in perfect penmanship, until the hand cramped and the mind went numb. The children learned quickly not to disobey, and they learned, even more quickly, not to speak of what happened when others did. Another descendant shared a diary entry written by his great-great-grandfather, a farmer whose son attended the school in 1899. The diary, a small leather-bound book with pages brittle as autumn leaves, had been preserved through generations, passed down as a family heirloom. The entry, dated November 12, 1899, was brief but chilling. Boy came home silent again. Will not say what troubles him. Schoolmaster says he is defiant. I do not believe it. There is fear in his eyes, not defiance. But what can I do? The boy must learn. There were no further entries about the school. The boy's name appeared in later census records. He survived childhood, married, had children of his own. But he left the area as soon as he was old enough, moving west and never returning, not even for funerals or family gatherings. He refused to speak of his school years, and when his own children asked, he would only say that some things were better left buried. Local folklore, too, carried traces of the truth. Elderly residents of nearby towns, those few still living who remembered the stories their own grandparents had told, spoke of the schoolhouse on Timber Road as a place children feared. Not because of ghost stories or superstition, but because of something real, something that had happened there and was never properly addressed. One story, repeated in several variations, told of a child who had simply stopped coming to school one winter. The family claimed the child had moved away to live with relatives in another state, but no one ever saw them again. No records supported the story. No letters arrived. And when neighbors asked, the family would change the subject, their faces tight with something that looked like shame or fear or both. Another story spoke of a day when parents arrived at the school unexpectedly, drawn by rumors they refused to name. They found the children sitting in perfect silence, not learning, not speaking, just sitting while the schoolmaster stood at the front of the room watching. The parents asked no questions. They took their children home and said nothing more. But after that day, attendance dropped. Families began keeping their children home for reasons they did not explain. The school limped on for another year, then closed. The shadow in the photograph began to take on new meaning. It was not an error, not a flaw in the film or a trick of the light. It was the visual echo of a presence that had dominated that schoolhouse, a figure who stood over those children, not just on the day the photograph was taken, but every day. A figure whose authority was absolute, whose actions went unquestioned, and whose crimes were buried beneath a century of silence. The photograph had captured what no one was willing to name, and the shadow, once noticed, could never be unseen. The building no longer stood, but the land remained. Overgrown with brush and saplings, the site of the old schoolhouse on Timber Road was now little more than a depression in the earth, marked by the faint outline of a foundation and a few scattered stones. But for those willing to search, traces of the past still lingered, waiting to be uncovered. Researchers visited the site in early spring, when the undergrowth was still thin enough to navigate. The journey required hiking through private farmland, following old property lines marked on century-old survey maps. The modern road ended a mile away, and the final approach had to be made on foot, cutting through fields that had long since returned to wild grasses and scrub oak. The foundation was easier to find than expected, a rectangle of stacked limestone, partially collapsed but still defining the shape of the original structure. It had been a small building, no more than 30 feet long and 20 feet wide. One room, one door, 2 windows on each side. The simplicity of frontier education, where a single teacher managed children of all ages, from 6-year-old beginners learning their letters to teenagers studying enough mathematics and grammar to pass the 8th grade examination that marked the end of formal schooling for most rural children. But as they cleared away decades of leaves and soil, other details emerged. The floor had been wooden, now rotted away almost entirely, but the joists remained, blackened and brittle with age and moisture. Beneath them, in the crawl space that had once provided airflow and insulation against the cold winter ground, they found objects that should not have been there. Iron hooks, driven into the support beams with the kind of force that suggested permanence, not temporary use. Lengths of rusted chain, still bolted to the wood. And in one corner, hidden beneath a collapsed section of wall and covered by years of fallen leaves and animal nests, a small wooden door, no more than 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, that led to a space beneath the floor. The door was locked from the outside. The lock itself was simple, a sliding bolt, rusted solid but still intact. It took tools to open, and when the door finally swung inward on protesting hinges, the smell that emerged was of damp earth and decay, the cold breath of a tomb long sealed. Inside the hidden space, the air was stale and thick, smelling of clay and rot and something else, something organic that had decomposed decades ago and left only the faintest chemical trace. The walls were bare dirt, the ceiling low enough that an adult would have to crouch or crawl. The space was perhaps 4 feet deep, 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, a coffin for the living. Scratches marked the wooden beams overhead, deep grooves carved by fingernails or some desperate makeshift tool. The marks were chaotic, overlapping, suggesting multiple instances of use, multiple children imprisoned here over time. And on one wall, pressed into the clay where moisture had kept it soft enough to hold an impression, a child's handprint, small and perfect, fingers splayed, as if pushing against the earth in a futile attempt to escape. This was not a storage space. This was a cell, a place where children were sent when they disobeyed, when they spoke out of turn, when they failed to meet the impossible standards of a man who believed discipline was indistinguishable from cruelty. How long were they kept there? Hours, days. The records would never say, but the evidence spoke louder than any document ever could. The scratches, the handprint, the locked door, these were the testimonies of children who had no other voice. Back at the surface, researchers measured the position of the foundation against the photograph, using architectural details visible in the image, the placement of windows, the angle of the walls, the distance between desks. The alignment was precise. The windows matched. The angle of light corresponded. And when they stood where the photographer would have stood, camera on tripod, framing the shot, they could see exactly where the shadow originated. Not from the window, not from the door, but from a spot near the center of the room, just behind the third row of desks, where someone tall and still had stood, watching the children as they sat in silence, waiting for the exposure to finish. The schoolhouse had burned in 1904, 2 years after it closed. No one knew how the fire started. No investigation was conducted. By the time anyone noticed the smoke, there was nothing left but ash and stone. Whether the fire was accident or deliberate intention, meant to erase evidence or simply the result of abandonment and decay, it hardly mattered now. The building was gone, but the shadow it cast had been captured, preserved in silver and gelatin, waiting for the day when someone would finally ask why. Among the 23 names listed in the school ledger for the 1898-1899 academic year, one stood out not for what it revealed, but for what it concealed. The name appeared only once, written in careful script at the top of a page, the letters formed with the kind of precision that suggested formal training and deliberate effort. Samuel Harrow, age 9. Beside it, a series of attendance marks, neat and consistent, running from September through mid-November. Small check marks in black ink, indicating presence, participation, the routine progress of a school year. And then, abruptly, the marks stopped. Not with a note, not with an explanation, not even with a line drawn through the name to indicate withdrawal. Just a blank space where the rest of the year should have been, as if Samuel Harrow had simply ceased to exist. Samuel Harrow did not appear in the county census. Not in 1900, not in 1890, not in any year before or after. He did not appear in birth records, which were admittedly incomplete for the era, but generally included children born to families with property. His name was absent from church registries, which recorded baptisms, confirmations, and deaths with meticulous care. He did not appear in family Bibles, those handwritten genealogies that rural families kept as sacred records of lineage. He was not mentioned in the informal genealogies compiled by local historical societies, nor in the obituaries and marriage announcements that filled the pages of small-town newspapers. It was as if he had existed only within the confines of that schoolhouse, and when he disappeared from its records, he disappeared from history entirely. But erasure, no matter how thorough, always leaves traces. History is not a single document, but a web of intersecting records, and when one thread is cut, the absence itself becomes evidence. Researchers found the first clue in a property deed dated March 1898, transferring ownership of a 40-acre farm from one owner to a man named Thomas Harrow. The deed, filed with the county recorder, mentioned a wife and 3 children, though their names and ages were not listed. Standard language for the time, when women and children were considered appendages of the male head of household, rather than individuals with legal standing. A second document, a tax record from 1900, listed Thomas Harrow as the sole occupant of the property. No wife, no children. The family had either moved or ceased to exist. The tax assessment was lower than it had been 2 years earlier, suggesting the farm was no longer being fully cultivated. By 1902, the property had been sold at auction for unpaid taxes, and Thomas Harrow vanished from the records as completely as his son. A third document, discovered in the basement archives of the county courthouse during a search through misfiled papers and forgotten boxes, provided the final piece. It was a handwritten note, filed with the school board in December 1899, requesting that a child's name be removed from the enrollment ledger due to family relocation. The note was brief, formal, and unsigned, though the handwriting matched that of other documents signed by the schoolmaster. No further details were provided. No forwarding address. No confirmation that the child had enrolled in another school elsewhere. Samuel Harrow had not relocated. Samuel Harrow had vanished. Descendants of other families who had lived in the area during that time offered their own fragments of memory, pieces of a puzzle that would never be complete, but could at least suggest an outline. One descendant recalled a story passed down through her grandmother about a boy who had been too curious, who had asked too many questions about why certain children were punished and others were not, and who had been made an example of for his defiance. The details were vague, the story told only once, late at night, in the kind of hushed tone reserved for things that were true but too terrible to examine closely. Another remembered hearing that a child had been sent away after accusing the schoolmaster of cruelty, though the accusation was dismissed by the school board as the imaginative lie of a disobedient student. The family, pressured and shamed, had left the area shortly after. Whether the child went with them or met some other fate, the story did not say. A third mentioned, almost in passing, that a grave had once existed near the old schoolhouse, unmarked and forgotten, though no one remembered whose it was or when it had been dug. By the time anyone thought to investigate, the site had been ploughed over, turned into farmland, and any trace of the grave had been erased. The photograph offered its own testimony. In the third row, second from the left, a boy sits with his hands folded tightly in his lap. His face is thin, his eyes large and dark, staring not at the camera but downward, as if unwilling or unable to meet the lens. He is smaller than the other children his age. His shoulders narrow, his posture hunched in a way that suggests either illness or chronic fear. The shadow falls just behind him, its shape looming over his small frame like a prophecy. If this boy was Samuel Harrow, then the photograph captured not just his image, but the moment just before he disappeared from history. And the shadow that looms behind him is not just a presence, but a threat. A reminder that power, unchecked and unchallenged, can erase a life as easily as crossing out a name. The erasure was deliberate. The records were altered. The truth was buried. But the photograph remained, carrying within it the evidence that someone tried to destroy. And the shadow, impossible and undeniable, marked the place where the person responsible once stood. To understand what happened on the day the photograph was taken, every detail had to be pieced together with forensic precision. The position of the children, the angle of the light, the timing of the exposure, the presence of the shadow, all of it could be reconstructed, and when it was, the truth became impossible to deny. The photographer would have arrived sometime in mid-morning, likely between 9 and 10 o'clock, when the light was strong enough to provide adequate exposure, but not so harsh as to create deep contrasts that would obscure detail. He would have been traveling, moving from town to town, offering his services to schools, churches, and families wealthy enough to afford a formal portrait. His equipment would have been cumbersome. A large format camera mounted on a wooden tripod, glass plates wrapped in protective cloth, bottles of chemicals for developing the images later in a makeshift darkroom set up in a hotel room or rented space. Setting up the shot would have taken time. The camera had to be positioned precisely, the lens focused, the exposure calculated based on the available light. The children would have been arranged in rows, tallest in the back, shortest in the front, hands visible, faces forward. The teacher would have helped, moving students into place, correcting posture, ensuring that no one blocked anyone else. Instructions would have been given clearly. Sit still, do not move, do not blink, do not smile. Any movement during the exposure would ruin the image. And in an era when photographic plates were expensive and time-consuming to prepare, there was no room for error. The exposure time for a photograph of this type would have been between 5 and 10 seconds, depending on the brightness of the day and the sensitivity of the plate. Long enough that even a slight shift in posture, a turned head, a lowered hand, a blink could create blur or ghosting. The children in this image show no blur. They are frozen, perfectly still, each face sharp and clear. This level of discipline was not natural for children, especially young ones. It required training, practice, and most likely fear. The shadow originates from a point approximately 6 feet behind the third row of desks, slightly to the left of center. Based on the angle and length, calculated using the known height of the windows and the time of day inferred from the light quality, it was cast by a figure standing upright, at least 6 feet tall, positioned between the children and the rear wall of the room. This figure would have been visible to the children, even if they were not allowed to turn and look. They would have felt the presence, the weight of being watched, the knowledge that any mistake would be noted and punished later. The photographer, focused on his technical work, would not have seen the shadow in real time. Early cameras did not have viewfinders in the modern sense. The photographer would compose the shot by looking at the ground glass at the back of the camera, which showed an inverted image of the scene. His attention would be on focus, on framing, on ensuring that the exposure was correct. The shadow, cast behind the children and partially obscured by desks and bodies, would not have registered as significant. It was just another element of the scene, another patch of darkness in a room full of contrasts. By the time the glass plate was developed, hours or even days later, and the final print made, the moment had passed. The figure had moved, the children had been dismissed, and whatever had happened in that room was already becoming history. But the photograph preserved it. The shadow was not a mistake, it was documentation. Evidence that someone stood among those children, close enough to cast a shadow, silent enough to go unnoticed by the photographer, powerful enough that the children dared not acknowledge the presence even by glancing in that direction. Reconstruction of the moment reveals one final, chilling detail. In order for the shadow to fall where it does, at the angle captured in the photograph, the figure would have been standing directly behind Samuel Harrow, the boy in the third row whose name would soon be erased from every record. The shadow falls across his shoulders, across the back of his head, as if marking him, choosing him. The photograph was not a simple school portrait. It was a record of control, of fear, of power exercised without restraint. And the shadow, captured by accident or by fate, became the only witness that could not be silenced, the only testimony that could not be altered or destroyed. There are crimes that are prosecuted, recorded, and remembered. Trials are held, verdicts are delivered, sentences are carried out. Justice in some form is served, and the events become part of the public record, available to historians and researchers who seek to understand the past. And then there are crimes that are buried, whispered about in private, and eventually forgotten. No charges are filed. No arrests are made. The truth is sealed beneath layers of silence, complicity, and collective amnesia. What happened at the schoolhouse on Timber Road was the latter. No trial was ever held. No arrest was ever made. The truth was sealed beneath a century of silence, preserved only in fragments, a missing name, a locked room, a shadow in a photograph. The evidence, pieced together across decades of research, points to a system of abuse that operated unchecked and unchallenged. The schoolmaster, whose name has been deliberately withheld from this account not to protect him, but to deny him the infamy he might have desired, was a figure of unquestioned authority in a rural community where education was both rare and revered. He had been trained at a normal school, had teaching credentials, and came with recommendations from previous positions. To the families who entrusted their children to him, he represented progress, civilization, the promise that their sons and daughters might rise above the hardscrabble existence of subsistence farming. What they did not know, or chose not to see, was the cost of that promise. The schoolmaster wielded power not just over lessons and discipline, but over the lives and identities of children who had no means of escape. Parents, many of them illiterate or barely literate themselves, struggling to survive on failing farms in an era of falling crop prices and rising debt, trusted the schoolmaster to shape their children into obedient, educated citizens. They saw strictness as a virtue, discipline as necessary. When children came home silent or bruised or frightened, parents assumed it was deserved. When a child was labeled as defiant or slow or morally weak, the label stuck, and the family bore the shame. Children were punished not just for misbehavior, but for curiosity, for questioning, for showing any sign of independence or critical thought. The locked space beneath the floor was not an isolated incident, not a single moment of cruelty. It was a tool, used regularly, systematically, to break the will of any child who did not conform. How many children were sent there? How long were they kept in darkness and cold, in a space too small to stand, too narrow to turn around? The records will never say, but the scratches on the beams, the handprint on the wall, the testimonies passed down through generations, they tell a story that words cannot fully capture. Samuel Harrow's disappearance was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable result of a system that valued control over compassion, silence over truth, authority over justice. Whether he died in that hidden space, whether he was taken elsewhere and buried in an unmarked grave, whether his family was coerced or bribed into leaving and never speaking of him again, these questions may never be answered with certainty. But the fact that his name was erased, that his existence was systematically removed from every record, speaks to a deliberate, coordinated effort to hide what had been done. In 1899, there were no child protection laws. There were no mandatory investigations when a child went missing. If a family left without explanation, no one followed up. If a school closed abruptly, no one demanded accountability. The structures that might have saved Samuel Harrow, that might have stopped the schoolmaster, simply did not exist. And so the crime continued, unreported and unpunished, until the school finally closed and the building was left to rot. The fire that destroyed the schoolhouse in 1904 may have been an attempt to erase the final physical evidence, though by then most of the families had already moved on and the building was abandoned. Whether the fire was intentional or accidental, it served the same purpose. It removed the last witness to what had happened there, leaving only memory, rumor, and silence. The photograph remains. It sits now in a climate-controlled archive, stored flat in an acid-free sleeve, protected from light and humidity and the slow chemical decay that claims all silver-based images eventually. It is available to researchers and historians, digitized and uploaded to online databases, viewable by anyone with an internet connection and the curiosity to look. The children in the image have names again, most of them. Their descendants have been found, their stories pieced together from diaries and letters and fading memories passed down through generations. Many of them lived full lives. They survived the schoolhouse on Timber Road, married, had children of their own, worked and struggled and found whatever happiness they could in a world that did not make it easy. But they carried the scars of those years long after, in silences and fears they could never quite name. But Samuel Harrow has no descendants. His name exists in only one place, on a single page of a school ledger, crossed out and forgotten, a brief notation in pencil that someone tried to erase. The boy in the photograph, sitting in the third row with his hands folded and his eyes downcast, may or may not be him. We will never know for certain. No family came forward to claim him. No letters surfaced with his name. No photographs exist showing him at any other age, in any other place. He has become, in death as in life, invisible. Except for the shadow. The shadow that looms behind him in the photograph is unmistakable. It is the shadow of a man who believed discipline was cruelty, who used fear as a tool of control, who wielded authority without accountability, and was never held responsible for what he did. The shadow is the visual record of power unchecked, of a system that protected abusers and silenced victims, of a society that looked away rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Photography, in its earliest days, was seen as a form of objective truth. The camera could not lie, people said. It captured reality as it was, unfiltered and undeniable, a mechanical witness immune to bias or emotion. And in this case, it did exactly that. It captured a moment that no one was meant to see, a shadow that should not have been there, a presence that was meant to remain invisible, a crime that was supposed to stay buried beneath a century of silence. The photograph forces us to confront a past that would prefer to be forgotten. It reminds us that silence is not the same as absence, that erasure is not the same as justice, and that sometimes the only witness to a crime is the accidental preservation of light and shadow on a piece of glass. It asks us to see what others chose to ignore, to name what others refused to acknowledge, to remember what history tried to erase. The children in the photograph are long gone now. They died decades ago, in old age if they were lucky, carrying with them memories they never fully shared. The schoolhouse is ash, scattered by wind and rain, its foundations slowly sinking back into the earth. The schoolmaster is dust, his name forgotten, his legacy reduced to a shadow in a photograph and a locked room beneath a rotted floor. But the shadow remains. It stretches across the wooden floor of a classroom that no longer exists, cast by a figure who believed he was untouchable, captured by a camera that did not care about power or authority or fear. It is a shadow that asks a question history could not answer, a question that the photograph refuses to let us forget. If no one cast this shadow, who did? We know the answer now. We know who stood there, watching those children, enforcing silence through fear. We know what happened to the boy whose name was erased. We cannot prove it in a court of law. We cannot bring charges or demand justice. The guilty are dead, and the systems that enabled them have long since evolved, though not always as much as we might wish. But we can look, we can see. We can refuse to turn away from the uncomfortable truths that history tried to hide. And we can remember Samuel Harrow, not as an absence, not as a crossed-out name in a ledger, but as a child who existed, who suffered, and who deserves to be remembered. The photograph is not just an image, it is a memorial, and the shadow is not just a shadow, it is a testimony, one that will never be silenced, no matter how much time passes, no matter how many generations come and go. Because some shadows once cast can never be erased.